In the shadowed valleys of ancient Laconia, where olive trees whispered to the wind and blood soaked the dust of forgotten fields, the Spartans forged an empire, not with words, but with spears. Theirs was a society built on discipline, brutality, and a belief that weakness in any form was a disease to be burned away. Every Spartan child was a weapon in training. Every woman, a vessel of strength and obedience. Every helot, a warning of what happened to those who failed to conquer. And in this cold machinery of survival, mercy had no place. Victory was not measured in territory or tribute. It was measured in the silence of those they conquered. When the Spartan phalanx marched, it moved like a wall of bronze and muscle, shields locked, spears aimed, hearts unflinching. Their enemies, from the Messenian rebels to the proud warriors of Argos, would meet them in the open plains, believing that courage and honor would decide the day. But they were wrong. What followed a Spartan victory was not simply death, but annihilation, not of armies, but of entire ways of life. The men who fell before Spartan steel were only the beginning. The true horror came later, in the aftermath, when the flames of war had dimmed, and only the women and children remained. On the ancient world, conquest often brought enslavement, but the Spartans elevated it to an institution, a way to maintain their society's dark equilibrium. Every defeated people became helots, slaves bound to the Spartan state, forced to till the land so their conquerors could dedicate themselves entirely to war. Yet what happened to the wives of those slain warriors was far more twisted. To the Spartans, the women of defeated enemies were not human beings deserving pity. They were living spoils of war, symbols of submission. But unlike other Greek city-states, which simply sold captives into slavery or Sparta had a more chilling approach. In their ideology, the body of a woman was both sacred and strategic, a means to strengthen the bloodline of Sparta or corrupt the lineage of their enemies. Some ancient sources whisper of ritualized humiliation, of ceremonies in which Spartan victors would select the wives and daughters of their fallen foes, parading them before the assembly as living trophies. The line between property and person vanished. What mattered was not their beauty, but their fertility, their potential to bear children molded by Spartan might, not foreign weakness. To be taken by a Spartan was not seen as a private act, but a public display of dominance, the continuation of war through flesh. There are accounts, pieced together from fragments of lost historians, that describe how after certain conquests, these women were forced to live among helots, stripped not only of their husbands but of their identities, their names erased, their lineage declared tainted by defeat. In some instances, they were compelled to serve in the households of their conquerors, not as wives, not even as slaves, but as living reminders of submission. To look upon a Spartan woman was to see pride and command. To look upon a conquered woman was to see what happened when pride met Spartan steel. The contrast was intentional, a social warning. The Spartan state was obsessed with control of its citizens, its slaves, its bloodlines. Nothing was left to chance. Even Spartan marriages were arranged not by love, but by utility. Women were encouraged to bear strong children, trained in physical exercise, and even publicly inspected for health and vigor. In such a society, the notion of what they did to conquered women becomes even more chilling, because to the Spartans, these captives were not simply spoils, they were raw material, clay to be reshaped or discarded according to the needs of the state. In some rare cases, if a woman of exceptional beauty or lineage was captured, she might be offered to a Spartan elder or warrior as a gift of honor. But this was no mercy, it was degradation, masked as privilege. The woman would be forced to live under the gaze of the very men who killed her husband or brothers. To refuse was to die. To accept was to bear children who would never truly belong, marked as half-bloods unfit for Spartan citizenship, yet too strong to be ignored. They lived in limbo, forever reminders of the cruelty that forged them. The cruelty extended beyond flesh and bone. The Spartans weaponized fear itself. They understood that to break a people completely, you had to destroy not just their warriors, but their legacy, their future. By desecrating the sanctity of their women, they struck at the heart of what held those societies together. Every child born of such unions became a living emblem of defeat, a reminder that the conquerors owned not just the land, but the very lineage of their enemies. This psychological warfare was as deliberate as their tactics on the battlefield. Imagine a night in a razed village, the men gone, their bodies left to rot where they fell. The women huddled in the ruins, clutching their children, hearing the rhythmic march of armored feet approaching. The torches glow red against the darkness as Spartan warriors move from house to house, not looting for gold, but claiming what they considered their due. The cries of the conquered echo into the night, swallowed by the indifferent stars. For the Spartans, this was not cruelty, it was order, a natural law. The strong ruled, the weak existed to serve or to be erased. And yet, beneath the perfection of Spartan discipline, there was rot. The helots, who outnumbered Spartans by as many as 7-1, seethed with resentment. The women taken from their conquered lands carried within them not just sorrow, but rebellion. There are whispers that some of these women poisoned their masters, smothered Spartan infants, or fled into the mountains to join bands of escaped slaves. These were acts of defiance, sparks of humanity in a world built to extinguish it. the Spartans responded with predictable ruthlessness, mass executions, purges, and the infamous cryptia where young Spartan men were sent to hunt helots under the cover of night. It was a cycle of violence with no end. Fed by the sins of conquest. The tragedy of Sparta lies in this paradox. The same system that made them invincible also damned them. Their obsession with strength bred weakness of another kind, a moral decay, so deep that even their victories became their undoing. The women they conquered, humiliated, and subjugated became ghosts, haunting their empire, a silent accusation carved into history itself. For centuries, the legend of Spartan glory has been polished and retold, the valor at Thermopylae, the discipline of the phalanx, the courage of Leon. But behind that bronze facade lies a truth few dared to record, that the same men who stood unflinching before Persian arrows could also turn their cruelty inward, upon the helpless and defeated. In the end, it wasn't an enemy army that destroyed Sparta, it was time, stagnation, and the unspeakable cost of their own brutality. When Thebes crushed them at Leuctra in 371 BC, the mighty Spartan illusion cracked forever. And among the ashes of their fallen city-state, one can almost hear the whispers of the forgotten, the women who bore the weight of conquest, whose names never made it into the annals of history, but whose suffering tells the real story of what Sparta became. Because what the Spartans did to the wives of the defeated was not just vengeance, it was the darkest reflection of their own ideals. When the dust of conquest settled over the Peloponnesian plains, the Spartan war machine turned inward, not to rebuild, but to maintain what they called order. Yet what the Spartans called order, others would have called oppression. The defeated were stripped of names, freedom, and lineage. The Helots, once proud Messenians, Arcadians, and Laconians, became shadows of people, existing only to serve those who had shattered them. But among them, the women bore the heaviest burden. Their husbands were gone, their sons forced into servitude or slain, and their own bodies reduced to symbols of subjugation. To be a woman in conquered Sparta was to live in the space between breath and silence, alive, but not permitted to exist freely. In the Spartan mind, domination had to be complete. Their state ideology demanded that no conquered people ever again threaten Spartan supremacy, and so they turned their cruelty into a science, refining it across generations. The Helot system became not only an economic backbone, but a psychological weapon. Each Spartan child, trained in the language, was taught that the Helots, and by extension, their women, were not equals, but tools. The boys learned to steal from them, beat them, even kill them without consequence. And the women, whether Helot or captive, became extensions of this silent war, their pain a part of the state's discipline, but the stories that filtered through the cracks of history paint a more haunting image. Some ancient writers, notably Plutarch and Tertius, though their accounts differ, suggest that the Spartans had a peculiar ritual following certain wars. After victory, the surviving wives of the defeated would be gathered and inspected, not by soldiers, but by elders of the state. The purpose was not compassion, it was evaluation, to determine which among them were fit for use, which could serve the polis, and which would simply vanish into the fields as helot labor. It was an institutionalized dehumanization that blurred the lines between governance and cruelty. One can imagine the horror of such moments, the clang of bronze armor echoing through stone halls, the cold stare of men who saw human life as resources. To those women, every gesture, every breath, became a negotiation for survival. And yet, in their silence, there was defiance. Many of these women found ways to resist. Some used the only weapon they had, deception. They learned to appear submissive while quietly protecting their children, preserving fragments of their old language, their customs, their gods. Beneath the stern order of Spartan life, an invisible network of remembrance grew, whispered prayers to long-forgotten deities, lullabies that carried the memory of fallen men, secret gatherings in the night where women remembered what Sparta wanted the world to forget. Over time, the children born of these unions, whether by force or circumstance, became a living paradox. They were not accepted as Spartans, yet not treated entirely as helots either. They were called mothakes, half-bloods, shadows between worlds. Some of them were trained alongside Spartan boys, especially those fathered by warriors but born to enslaved women. Their very existence was proof of the contradictions within Sparta's system, a society obsessed with purity, creating generations of impurity, and through them, the conquered bloodlines endured. Hiding in plain sight among their conquerors, in the fields of Messenia, resentment simmered for decades. Women whispered tales of their slain husbands to their sons, planting seeds of vengeance. Every harvest gathered by their hands was an act of defiance, a forced tribute paid in hatred. The Spartan overseers could feel it, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. And in the 7th century BC, that storm finally broke. The Helot revolt erupted, a rebellion born from generations of cruelty. The Spartans crushed it, of course, but the rebellion's heart came not from warriors. It came from the women who refused to forget. Plutarch wrote that during the revolt, many Helot women smuggled food, weapons, and messages between rebel factions. Some even fought, disguised as men, on the front lines. Their names were erased, their deeds unrecorded, but their defiance was real. They had seen their husbands killed, their dignity stripped, and yet, even in the face of the most disciplined army in Greece, they fought for freedom, for revenge, for the right to be human again. But the Spartan state, in its paranoia, responded with the Krypteia, a chilling institution that turned young Spartan men into sanctioned murderers. Each year, the Ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, would declare war on the Helots. Not metaphorically, literally. This declaration gave every Spartan citizen the legal right to kill any Helot, without religious consequence. At night, boys of the Agogid Barely men crept into the fields and villages, murdering suspected rebels, often families, often women. It was a ritual of fear designed to remind the conquered who ruled them. And through it all, the wives and daughters of the defeated became the primary victims, widowed again and again by a system that demanded their pain as tribute. In this atmosphere of terror, love itself became rebellion. There are fragmented tales, mostly oral traditions passed down by later Greek writers, of forbidden relationships between Spartan men and Helot women. Some claim these were born from lust, others from genuine affection. But to the state, both were crimes. Any Spartan caught showing compassion toward a Helot woman risked disgrace, even exile. The laws of Lycurgus, Sparta's legendary lawgiver, demanded purity above all, not just in blood, but in obedience. So those rare moments of tenderness were acts of defiance, quiet flickers of humanity in a world built on dominance. Still, for most, there was no escape. Generations of women lived and died beneath Spartan boots, their stories untold. Yet their suffering left an imprint even on their masters. The Spartan obsession with control of women, slaves, even emotions, eventually strangled their society from within. When the Peloponnesian War came, and Sparta found itself entangled in endless conflict with Athens, the cost of their inhuman system began to show. The population of full-blooded Spartans dwindled catastrophically. Centuries of selective breeding and the prohibition of mixed unions had left them vulnerable to extinction. Ironically, the very women they had enslaved could have been their salvation, but their arrogance would never allow it. The Spartan elite refused to recognize the children of Helot mothers as true citizens. Even as their numbers fell, even as their once mighty armies struggled to muster the warriors they needed, they clung to their purity like a curse. The system that had begun with the subjugation of women now devoured itself. By the 4th century BC, Sparta was a shadow of its former glory. Its enemies watched as internal decay spread through its once serene structure. The wives of the defeated, now generations removed from the original wars, still bore the weight of that legacy. Their daughters worked the fields their grandmothers had once tended as slaves. Their sons grew strong but bitter, knowing that no matter how much they bled for Sparta, they would never be accepted as equals. History records no monuments for them, no elegies or hymns. But their existence was a monument to endurance, to quiet rebellion, to the truth that even in the darkest empires, humanity refuses to die. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony of all. The Spartans believed they could erase weakness by erasing mercy. But in doing so, they created a legacy of suffering that outlived their own greatness. Their cruelty became their curse. Their silence became history's condemnation. For while the names of kings, like Leonidas, echo in legend, the whispers of the nameless, the wives, the mothers, the daughters of the conquered, form the truer, darker chorus of Sparta's song. Every empire tells its story in glory. But the real history, the one written in whispers and tears, belongs to those who were never meant to be remembered. By the time the 4th century BC rolled over the Peloponnesian Peninsula, Sparta's famed invincibility had begun to crack like brittle bronze. The once feared warriors, molded in the relentless Agoge, faced enemies, both external and internal. The Greek world had shifted. Athens rose, Thebes challenged, and even distant Macedon whispered of a power that would someday eclipse them all. But more insidious than the armies on the horizon was the legacy of cruelty they had sown within their own borders. The unyielding oppression of Helots and the subjugation of conquered women. Their victories, celebrated in song and story, had left behind generations of resentment and silent rebellion that the historians of the time barely dared acknowledge. The wives of the defeated warriors, whose suffering had been largely invisible in contemporary chronicles, had forged a power born of endurance. They were the living witnesses to Spartan ruthlessness, their stories etched, not in stone or parchment, but in whispers, songs, and hidden acts of defiance. Mothers taught their daughters the ways of survival in a world that saw them as tools, not humans. Children grew up learning both fear and cunning, observing every gesture of their Spartan masters and planning small but precise acts of revenge. These women were the silent architects of an invisible resistance, a web of subversion that stretched from the fields to the very heart of Spartan society. The Helot revolts, though ultimately suppressed, were only the visible tip of this submerged resistance. Scholars today suggest that the subjugated women played an indispensable role in sustaining it. They smuggled intelligence, guided fugitives through hidden routes in the mountains, and nurtured networks of families loyal to the memory of those who had been slaughtered. For the Spartans, these women were meant to be erased. Yet their very existence undermined the ideological purity that the state demanded. Every child born of mixed blood, every act of cunning survival, became a fissure in the armor of Sparta's infallibility. As Spartan influence waned, the full impact of their cruelty became evident. Cities that had once trembled at the sight of the red cloaks of hoplites now openly rebelled, forming coalitions to challenge Spartan dominance. Internal decay accelerated as the population of full Spartan citizens declined, partially due to their obsession with bloodline purity. Young Spartans trained relentlessly in the arts of war, yet there were fewer and fewer to command. In this void, the offspring of conquered women, the so-called Mothakes, quietly assumed roles that Sparta's rigid society had denied them. Some became skilled soldiers, tacticians, or advisors, their loyalty complex, divided between a society that had oppressed them and their own desire to survive and wield power. Ironically, the Spartan obsession with control had created the seeds of its own undoing. Every woman they had humiliated, every helot forced into silent servitude, had carried the memory of injustice like a smoldering ember. That ember flared in unexpected moments. There are accounts, fragmented and disputed, of women infiltrating Spartan councils under disguise, manipulating alliances, or ensuring that key resources reached rival powers. Some historians even theorize that their covert actions contributed to Spartan defeats in critical battles. From Leuctra to Man, the same society that believed it could command every facet of life ultimately fell victim to the consequences of its own cruelty. Yet, even amidst this collapse, Sparta's legend endured a double-edged sword of inspiration and horror. Scholars, storytellers, and philosophers marveled at their martial discipline, their courage, their ability to hold a phalanx against overwhelming odds. And yet, when one scratches beneath the surface, the real narrative is far darker, a society that measured strength not only in battlefield prowess but in the oppression of women, the erasure of enemies, and the cold calculation of psychological terror. The lessons of Sparta are not just about courage, but caution that a civilization built on fear and cruelty inevitably consumes itself. In the quiet countryside, far from the marble statues and heroic inscriptions, the descendants of those enslaved and humiliated lived on. They tended the land, whispered the tales of their ancestors, and bore children who carried the blood of both conqueror and conquered. These descendants, invisible to history's spotlight, ensured that the stories of Spartan cruelty would never vanish entirely. The names of the women who suffered, the lives of those who endured forced unions, the silent acts of rebellion, all became threads in a hidden tapestry that historians can only glimpse today. They remind us that even in the most rigid empires, humanity finds a way to resist. And so, as the sun set on Spartan dominance, the empire that had once imposed terror across the Peloponnesus fell not just to armies, but to the unrecorded acts of courage and defiance carried out by those it sought to erase. The wives of defeated warriors, forgotten in mainstream histories, emerge in this narrative as symbols of resilience, living proofs that even the strongest regimes cannot suppress the human spirit indefinitely. They embody the dark truth behind Spartan legend, that glory built on cruelty is fragile, and that history eventually remembers the forgotten. So, when you think of Sparta, remember this. Every hero in a crimson cloak stands atop the bones of lives silenced, and the whispers of those silenced are the truer legacy. If the haunting truths of history, hidden atrocities, and untold stories intrigue you, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Dive deeper into the dark corners of the past with us, uncover the untold, confront the unspeakable, and witness history as it was never meant to be forgotten.